Joined today by Corey Henderson, the longtime and highly successful head boys basketball coach at Episcopal of Dallas, who also wears all sorts of other hats in the realm of making sure kids have a better experience and diversity and inclusion. And Coach, my first question to you is, tell us about your own personal experiences with whether it's nonviolent police harassment, be it pulled over for a reason, or something worse, or maybe just your general experiences with dealing with racism as a black man in America.
So first thing, Pete, thank you for having me on the Zoom call and your show as well, podcast. But to get right into it, to answer your question, I have not experienced, personally, I have not experienced anything in the realm of being stopped by a police officer, whether it be a vehicle or even on foot, or harassed in any way, shape, or form by a police officer.
And I'm really happy that you said that, simply because I don't want these videos to feel propagandistic. You were the second black friend of mine out of a pretty large sample size who has not had that particular personal experience. And so prior to about a month ago, I would say universal. And now I'll say all of my black friends, except for two so far, have had that type of experience. So I'm curious, what about close friends of yours? What if it's like, do you consider your experience to be the rule or the exception?
I think it's more of the kind of exception. I think I actually, based on my upbringing, first, let me just say this as well. I think a lot of luck probably played a part in that as well, along with just me making sure that I follow kind of the rules of what my parents wanted me to understand in dealing with police officers, whether it be me in my vehicle or not. And so, in saying that, they taught me probably what other black parents have taught their boys or girls, and that's, when you're being pulled over by a police officer, put your hands on the steering wheel. Yes, sir. No, sir. I'm going into my glove compartment to get my, at the time, glove compartment to get my, insurance. I've got my wallet here. Is it okay if I do that? But also making sure that that they're understanding me clearly, and that I'm articulating what I'm saying in a manner in which they understand it. I say that because all of that, to me, is important. Some of my friends have experienced what you've stated, by being pulled over for no reason other than they have a nice car. And so I think it's important that, and we've got examples of people that have done that and still have been, treated different. But I can only talk about my own experiences. And so, I've had friends who have, one of my best friends who went to MacArthur High School in Houston, had an opportunity. His parents gifted him a pretty nice car, a two-door Lexus, and this was back in 94 or 93. And so he had been pulled over 6 or 7 times driving around North Houston in that MacArthur area, just for the simple fact that he had a nice car. He didn't break any rules. They just pulled him over just because he had the nice car. And, and black male driving a nice car, in certain areas can be what they see as a red flag, which is not right, but that's just kind of what it was.
Well, and so you went to Lee High School in Houston.
Mm-hmm.
That time was probably 75% white. Is that?
Yeah, even 80%, 75, 80% white.
Well, I know you were a great athlete, and you're also a sociable person. So I'm sure you had a variety of white friends. And for those who don't know, Lee High School in Houston no longer exists. And the demographics now are virtually 100% Latino. And there's a new high school called West Side that opened. And well, the neighborhoods that Lee served were Tanglewood and Memorial, some very affluent, uh, almost all white parts of town. And so you had a black friend who drove a nice car who got pulled over regularly for being black while driving a nice car. Did any of your white friends from Lee that drove nice cars just sort of constantly get pulled over for being like a high school kid in a nice car? And I'm talking about, of course, not when they were speeding or drinking and driving. Right? I got pulled over lots as a white high school kid at a private school driving a nice car, but that's because I was doing, 48 and 30 and that type of thing. I mean, no one is saying it's not okay for the police to pull people over. We're just trying to point out the disparity between the reasons and the race. So,
yeah, to answer your question, Pete, the answer to that is no. Those that I knew never came back with a story of, well, the police pulled me over just because. Maybe it was because they were doing other things excessively, participating in adult-like activities on the weekends, or even during games. My dad was an assistant principal at Lee. He was also a principal at Jack Yates, was a principal at Key Middle School, was a stadium administrator as well. So, did that help me? Did that help me and expose me to a lot of things that people sometimes are not exposed to? Yes. I saw things that some of my other counterparts were not exposed to, and that's just not even other black males, but even white males or white females or black females, just for the simple fact that he was an administrator, and there are a lot of things that obviously he had privy to, and things that he changed at the school that I had kind of an ear distant shot of just by me sitting in his office when I was done with school, after basketball practice, or even hearing at home. Just hearing a lot of things and digesting a lot of things, I think helped me knowing what to do and how to handle it in certain scenarios and situations. But again, none of my white counterparts or friends that I knew of were pulled over by a cop just because.
And so you mentioned something earlier, you kind of touched on it again just now. And so I want to say something to the white people out there watching, because a lot of white people will look at a police on black interaction that goes south, sometimes tragically south. And it's super common for white people to say, well, you got to be more respectful toward the police, right? They're armed, they have the power, you've got to. What I want to say is that what Corey said with his last two answers, it's 1,000,000% okay for an older black man to try to help younger black men learn how to interact with the police as safely as possible. That's Corey's place, not your place, white people. So don't look at anything he just said and feel like, well, you see, if they would just act right when the cops pulled him over, none of this would happen. It's not your place to feel that way or say anything along those lines. And frankly, you're rather racist if you do. And then the other thing you need to keep in mind is that Corey never got pulled over unconstitutionally when he hadn't done anything wrong. And he has friends that's happened to multiple times. So imagine if your constitutional rights were constantly being abused based on your race. Do you really think you would be 100% universally deferential and respectful to the person who was violating your rights? You know you wouldn't. You know how much we as white people value our rights. Look at the people storming the Capitol in Michigan because they didn't want to wear a mask. You know you wouldn't put up with that. So it's patronizing, racist, and fucked up when you as a white person go down that path. So please knock it the fuck off. So sorry about that, Coach. Now, getting back to what we were talking about. So you mentioned that you feel like this stuff, the cultural connection between the culture that allows the nonviolent, unconstitutional police harassment to occur is inexorably linked to the culture that permits the brutality and the murders, the connection between that not enough white people recognize. And you already said that, unfortunately, even though of your personal experience, it's based on conversations with many black friends, that your pretty strong hunch is that these problems are not isolated. They're more something that we need to really
We need to address. Yeah, they need to be addressed. Pete, I mean, everybody always goes back to education. You know, education is the key. Education is the key to, you know, pulling yourself out of, you know, being in a certain economic bracket, or pulling yourself, or maintaining a certain level of status, or making more money. And so I would also say that if that's the case, which a lot of that is true, I think, but it boils down to resources as well. And so if communities or areas or people are lacking resources, so education and money, there is going to continue to be a gap. But the education that I want to hone in on more is the education about, you know, I mentioned to you earlier that my son, we were talking one day via Zoom, matter of fact, and I had my team on the Zoom. We were covering areas like we do every Saturday, because I want to make sure that these young men, both white and black, are able to leave ESD prepared for the real world. And so what he stated to me, which came out to be true because I researched it, was a simple fact that cops, law enforcement officials, police officers spend less time in training and being certified than do barbers, which to me is screaming and very alarming, because if cops are supposed to protect and serve and to maintain order, and they're less trained than barbers, then therein lies a lot of the issue as well. And so when I say the word education, we should all be educated in a way that anybody can go up to whoever, and we should be able to trust each other, that the education that you have is going to help and play a big part, whether it be, you know, de-escalation training, you know, learning how to, and within that de-escalation training, understanding how to talk to someone at a certain time, or what to say or what not to say during a certain time of confrontation. We talked earlier about me. Somebody asked me if I would, you know, would you ever be a cop? And my answer right away was no, just for the simple fact that I don't think I could be under the gun like they are, quote unquote, of maintaining my cool and maintaining my calm in situations that cops are in, whether they put themselves in that situation or they are in the situation because of circumstances surrounding them. I don't think I could do that.
I couldn't either.
So Pete, I chose to go other routes with what my education afforded me to do. You know, so being a police officer is not an easy job. But I also feel like if you're going to be a police officer, then police officers need to be educated and trained longer than what they are being trained. There are other countries that have longer training periods of time, 2 to 3 years of being trained as an officer before you release to leave the academy and take on being a police officer. And statistics show that crime is not as plentiful in those other countries as there are in the United States. That doesn't mean that racism does not exist in those other countries. But again, we're talking about, you know, discrimination when we're talking about police officers and being pulled over. So,
well, there's One, I completely agree that it's necessary to have much more training and education for police officers in really a comprehensive way. Even bringing in, like, for example, there's an empathy gap. And this is not just in policing, this is in society. And, uh, and a good friend of mine, a guy named Daryl Bennett, we went to Lamar together. And then we also went to Trinity together. And we were having a conversation about race one night, probably a couple of cocktails, and the get over it thing came up, right? Where a lot of white people get over it. And Daryl made the point, and it really stuck with the rest of my life. You know, he said, you know, Peter, my mom as a little girl had to go squat in the woods to use the restroom on family road trips for vacation because the white gas station owner wouldn't let her use the toilet. She had to go in the woods like an animal because the white attendant didn't see her as a human. And so, you know, even for, and again, not just cops, but really society in general, when you hear stories like that, it's like, you know, imagine living in a nation that treated your mother when she was a harmless little girl like a fucking animal. And then someone looks at you and says, get over it. You know, so the training and the education, yes, de-escalation, yes. And you look at the FBI, who's not running around, you know, I've never seen a video in the last decade, certainly, of the FBI implementing what the military used to call the Code Red. That was the Eric Garner situation. It was 5 pissed off, angry, probably steroid-fueled cops who were racist to begin with. They'd arrested Eric Garner a ton of times before, and he was still selling loose cigarettes to provide for his family. And that should never be a crime in the first place, but that's based on corporate lobbying. We're not going to go down that path today. But it was a Code Red. They wanted to teach him a lesson. I don't think that they intended to murder him. I think they all should have gotten manslaughter 1 convictions, 15 to life. I think the intent was the Code Red. But I wonder if you don't see FBI officers doing Code Reds, right? You just don't. And
Yeah.
part of the reason is I believe you have to have a master's.
Yep.
The training is sort of indefinite.
Yep.
And so I wrote about this in my book that one of the things I would do is that if you're a cop without a college degree, a 4-year college degree, police intern, the main difference being that you have rubber bullets, not real bullets.
Wow.
So you're not getting called to the scene of bank robberies. I'm not trying to get police interns murdered. But then we, as taxpayers, pay for them to gradually get the college degree, at which point they can become an actual full-fledged police officer. So I agree with you 1,000,000% that training and education and, again, simply empathy. I wonder if those 5 cops in Staten Island had a friend like Daryl Bennett who told them about his mother, which is just devastating to hear.
You know, Pete, but you also you brought up a good point, though, and we keep talking about education. A lot of it, some of it stems from your upbringing as well, your own experiences, where you grew up, who you've been dealing with, who you've dealt with, the reactions of dealing with that, the wounds that you have that have not healed. I tell people all the time, your horizontal can't be aligned if your vertical is not. So you can't treat me well, right? If you're not well, there's no way. And so, but it goes back to, all of it goes back to education. You know, infusing more diversity in the curriculum. You know, so at ESD, where I currently work, we have done some things to mandate that the curriculum is more diverse. And so our head of diversity and inclusion has been given the task of doing that, and she's done some of that as we speak. And so it's just sometimes you want to give people the benefit of the doubt. If you don't know, you don't know. Your experiences are your experiences. If I've lived in River Oaks all my life, or if I've lived in Highland Park all my life, if I've lived in certain areas that are heavy white, or let's flip it. If I've lived in an area that's mainly black, my experiences are going to be minute. They're going to be small. And so the education that I'm referencing is being able to branch out and go out and being able to, hear others' opinions and hear ideas, but also being able to educate people based on how I was brought up as well, because I think I'm well versed and I've got a pretty balanced, what I would say balanced in terms of being around different types of people a lot, not only with my education, but working in corporate, now working in education, my professional experience of playing basketball, my college experiences, all of that, but also keeping an open mind to hearing what people are saying. So I think it's important that you hear what people say, because a lot of times we react to what it sounds like versus hear what people are saying. I think that's a little bit of it as well.
Well, you made a couple of really good points. And one, you talked about the vertical and horizontal integration, and kind of a similar way to phrase that I've heard is that hurt people hurt people.
Yep.
And I interviewed Lamar Glass, who's a black police officer in Dallas, who played for Coach Mayo, and I used to work for Coach Mayo at Skyline. And he talks about how that the funding and the availability for mental health and wellness therapy for police officers is practically non-existent. And, he said off camera, you wouldn't believe what I've seen. I that's a very important point. It's like people need to understand, yes, there are the fringe groups that literally want to abolish all police.
Correct.
That's, though, not even 1% of the country. It's that maybe 0.1 or 0.01. But I wish that we, as people who want to see real reform, I wish that our messaging was better, because it sounds like we're going after the cops, which means they're going to get defensive and we all head to our battle stations. And the reality is that I think there'd be sweeping support for a federal bill to provide funding for mental health therapy for police officers, especially if it was mandatory.
Yeah.
I think there'd be broad bipartisan support for that, and that would be a good thing for police.
Yeah, it'd be a great thing.
Not just for the citizenry. And then the other thing that I wanted to touch on is you talked about Highland Park and River Oaks and how the less, if you're white in particular, because of course racism is our fault, even though it winds up being y'all's problem, it's still our fault. I saw a great analogy where the white people are living in the apartment upstairs with a leaky pipe, screwing up the black apartment downstairs. And we just keep looking at y'all like, when are you going to clean up the water? It's like, oh, when are you going to stop the fucking leak?
Yeah.
And so a friend of mine who's been certainly an ally, possibly even a radical ally, which is my favorite types of allies and what I strive to be. He is a Highland Park kid, and a mother was saying like really racist shit. And so he spoke up. And she, of course, said, I'm not a racist. That's not, the incident I call a self-issue comparative clemency. Well, Connor's a racist. David Duke's a racist. I can't be a racist because I'm not as bad as they are. And like we talked about before, there's a scale. And then she tried to defend her racism by saying they had one black kid on the team at this time. I think his name was Steven, if my memory serves. And she said, a racist, but, little Billy's like almost best friends with Steven. Steven's at our house all the time. He stays here. He's would a racist do that? And my buddy said, would you let Steven date your daughter?
Yep.
And she got marbles in the mouth, turned red, and was on the verge of tears because he held a mirror up in a way that she couldn't sidestep it. And so I write a lot in the book as well. I strongly encourage any white parents who are watching this, whether your neighborhood's diverse, whether your school's diverse, make sure that your child's experiences are diverse. It's incredibly helpful if instead of playing at the youth basketball at the church 5 blocks from home, go play youth basketball at the church 40 blocks from home.
But I would also add, Pete, that's a good point about, I mentioned diversity, but I also want to make sure I use the word inclusive, because diversity comes in different shapes and forms, socioeconomic, color, all of that. But the inclusivity part to me is more important, because if you're not including me in on conversations that are going to affect me or affect someone that looks like me, then you're not getting my viewpoint. You're not getting the viewpoint of a Black man with all of my history and my upbringing. If we're talking about making things equitable, then if that's the case, then I think the inclusivity part is huge. It's very huge. Here's an illustration, Pete. Picture me standing in an ocean, and I have a broom. And you made the comment, which is so true, that in order to fix the problem, you got to fix the system. And so just picture water continuing to come at me, and my job is to try to fix the issue with this broom of sweeping away the water pretty much from coming up on shore. Well, there's no way I can do that. Obviously, with just a broom, but the simple fact that if the system is not fixed, then we can keep going toe-to-toe or talking about until we're blue in the face about, ways in which we can go about doing things. The system has to be fixed before all the other stuff is tackled. And so I have a broom and I'm trying to keep this water off the shore, but it's just steady coming and it's steady coming. That's how so many, myself included, in an indirect way and somewhat of a direct way, even working in corporate America, which I worked in corporate in Houston, getting some discriminatory racial stuff, even in that area of my life, which now was, well over 20 years ago. I'm 46 now.
Well, that's I talk about this a lot as well. Any white people watching who want to be better allies, it's incumbent upon us to speak up when we see a white person, especially in a position of power, make a racist remark, either to a Black person or about a Black person, because, and I say this especially to white coaches, I've said this so many times, if you're a white college basketball coach, there's no downside to being a great ally. No downside. If you're a Black college basketball coach, there is risk, because it's super easy for a white booster or a white AD or a white president to say, we're looking for a basketball coach, not an activist. And of course, every assistant coach wants to be a head coach. But if you're white speaking up, they don't say that. If anything, they say, oh, I bet this white guy, this white coach, who's also an activist on the side, his activism will probably help him recruit Black kids. So and by the way, it probably would. Uh, I'm guessing I'd be more successful as a recruiter of black kids than I was 10 years ago because of the book and other things. Of course, I'm not in that line of work, but it's like I'm trying to get white folks to be like so it's like you're in a corporate meeting and your boss says something racist that he didn't even probably think was racist, like, Corey, you're different, or you're one of the good ones. And of course, what they're really saying is that they're so racist, their expectation of black people is so low that when they meet a black person who isn't, like, I don't know, reeking of weed, sagging pants, with a do-rag, 500 million, like the whatever, like that's representative.
Right.
Black people, and of course it's not. But in his racist mind, it was. So it's like, well, you're one of the good ones, So the white people who were there needed to speak up for you.
Yeah.
Because if you spoke up every time that type of thing happened, then they're going to think of you as a troublemaker. You're going to sabotage your own career.
Right. Yep. Pete, and that is key. That's so key. I mean, everybody, you want to teach your kids. You want to teach. My parents have taught me to advocate for myself, right? To speak up for yourself. But you hit it on the head. A lot of times, when you do speak up for yourself, you're coming across as somebody that is the troublemaker, or, and so you end up reframing from saying something for the simple fact that you don't want to be labeled as this particular person. And so I was talking to somebody last week about this. It is very difficult for me to separate my professional from my personal. I so want to. I have a way of going about that. I may not be quick to vocalize my thought. I may take a different approach to that. Now, some people will say, well, that's healthier. Some people may say, no, that's not as healthy. Whatever. But it's very difficult for me, being a black male, working where I'm working with our brown and black students, when things arise or something comes up, and I don't advocate for that particular young man or young girl with whatever happened or whatever's going on. But I say to you that a lot of I've had friends who everybody has a choice. And we talk about it, and sometimes they even are so taken aback or just so angry with themselves because they sit there and they start thinking about, well, why didn't I say something? Why didn't I do something? And then, Pete, they start thinking about their job. They start thinking about, their level of status or how they're living. They're living comfortably. I just think that right is right and wrong is wrong. But not everybody has that same thought process. Not everybody has that same thought process. So we're not only dealing with, racial inequalities, we're dealing with issues of our society and the moral fabric of our society being all screwed up. Like so screwed up that, we've got people in high places and high positions that serve our United States that don't speak up when people say things that are just absurd and asinine and racist. Because everybody has their own agenda on things that they want and need to get met. And so sometimes they just stay quiet. So I think, it's even bigger than, it's racism obviously is a new pandemic. I mean, it's an old pandemic, not a new pandemic, it's an old pandemic. but the morality is also something that I think we've lost as a society as well.
Well, it does feel like sometimes the anonymity of the internet allows ugliness to go unrebuked, and we certainly. I'm not going to call myself the world's greatest champion or for on the topic of morality, or call that my particular area of expertise. And I even go so far as to deliberately try to detach morality from racism in many instances, because I know that if a white person hears you say you're a bad person, the conversation's over. And right. I can't make any headway at all on that white person. So that's one of the reasons why I talk about the scale so much. I think that the 7s, 8s, 9s, and 10s are bad people and racist. I think the 4s, 5s, and 6s are moderates, which makes them racist, but not necessarily evil intentioned. And then I think the 1s, 2s, and 3s are allies, not evil, but still racist, because we have inadvertent reflexive thoughts. The smallest thing can be racist. One of the stories I like to give to illustrate my own racism is that when I was working at Skyline, a kid was late to practice who was kind of a class clown, like a brilliant kid, and he was not normally late. And so Coach Mayo was like, "Where have you been?" And he said, "Come on, Coach, it's just CPT." Well, I didn't know what the hell that meant. Well, I inquired, and they said, "Well, that's colored people time." And then some people say BPT instead of CPT. But it was black people who let me in on that little joke. Now, ever since then, if I'm meeting a black friend for lunch or a drink or whatever, and they're a little bit late, I'm always chuckling to myself about CPT. Now, that sounds kind of harmless because it's a little joke that I was let in on by black people. Mm-hmm. But I'm attaching that person's race with their individual behavior.
Correct.
And that's fucking racist. Mm-hmm. And it's incumbent upon me to say that. It's racist when I attach someone's behavior to their race. That's like one of the definitions of it. And so to white folks out there listening, it's okay morally to be a racist as long as you're fighting against it. If you're not self-checking and fighting against it, and oftentimes because you can't even admit it, that's when morality, to me, properly should be dragged back in. And I would start to think of you as a bad person for not having enough empathy for your fellow humans to want to make positive changes in your own heart and brainwashed mind to try to make this situation better. So, well, Coach, I wonder if you got anything else to add. This has been I really value and appreciate your insights.
No, just just with anything, I think, not to bring in religion by any means. I am a Christian male, black male, and the one thing that I think has kept me sane and has sustained me is a simple fact that I always go back and realize that God has created everyone in an image of Him. And so in saying that, your value comes from Him. Not from man, but it comes from Him. And so always, when people are down, always, obviously, I'll read scripture, but just praying is huge for me. But also my go-to is Invictus. And so I always try to recite that in my mind.
Sorry to interrupt. Is Invictus a chapter in the Bible?
Invictus. It's a poem.
Oh,
yep. By William Ernest Henley. And it's a poem that I actually had to recite it as a member of Kappa Alpha Psi fraternity. And so that was something that we had to do, was to recite that verbatim. And so that's a go-to of mine. Out of the night that covers me, black as a pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. In the fell clutch of circumstance, I have not winced nor cried aloud. Under the bludgeon of chance, my head is bloody but unbowed. Beyond this place of wrath and tears looms but the horrible shade, and yet the minutes of the years shall find me unafraid. It matters not how straight the gate, but how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. And so I always go back to that as kind of my go-to, just because, things get tough, but you got to have that rock that you lean on in everything you do. And for me, it's Jesus. I'm not a perfect human being by any means, but I think the more you align yourself with that spiritual being, that helps to keep you sane. It helps to keep you aligned. It helps to keep you focused. We all have that innate ability to sense when something's not right, always. And so I think the more we stay aligned with whoever your higher power being is, again, for me, it's Jesus. I think that helps me in every aspect of my life, every aspect, from raising kids to, whatever it may be. If you're married, not married, in a relationship, whatever it may be, it just keeps you aligned properly. So that's, those are some words I wanted to leave. Pete, thank you for having me on your podcast. I appreciate your time.
Well, I hope that any white people listening, to monitor your own mental health and wellness is critical for all humans. And I want the white people listening to understand this is a good example of white privilege. On top of Corey having to monitor his own mental health and well-being just based on being human, he has to take extra steps in that realm based on being a black man in America. And so this doesn't mean that, and we as white people don't have to do that. And that's what white privilege is. No one's saying everything's always easy for white people. No one's saying every white person was born with a trust fund. No one is saying that no black people ever made it. There's just extra layers of difficulty that come with being black in America, in some ways, especially a black man. And then the other thing I want to say is I'm not really much of a Christian, and when I read the Old Testament, I find it frankly disturbing more than anything else. Like large passages, I'm like, ugh, like that, ugh. That's not really a God that I want to. But I don't think there's any examples of the written word of just more chock full of righteousness and morality than the New Testament. So I greatly admire the teachings of Jesus Christ, even though I don't really consider myself to personally be a Christian. I also greatly admire many of the teachings of Confucius, and Buddha, and Muhammad, and Abraham. And one of the reasons why it's confusing to me to pick one, it feels to me like what is and is not righteous is very similar between all of the different major religions. And Confucianism, of course, is more of a philosophy than a religion, but there's some overlap. And so I just find myself thinking, God sent Abraham because that's what was needed at the time. God sent Buddha because that's what was needed at the time. God sent Muhammad, God sent Jesus, God sent Confucius. That's just kind of what makes the most sense in my own mind. So it's like, I guess you could call me religiously confused, but I can tell you this, I thank you so much for your time. And look forward to staying in touch. And And again, Corey Henderson from Episcopal School of Dallas, thank you so very much for joining us.
Thank you, Pete.
I'm going to stop recording.